The station bell rang once. Then the platform fell quiet again. The woman stepped down from the train into a wind that came straight across Lake Superior, cold enough to bite through wool. She tightened her grip on the worn leather bag in her hand and searched the small crowd. Families found each other. Travelers waved. Wagons rolled away one after another. No one was waiting for her. She stood alone beneath the pale October sky while the last of the passengers disappeared. The advertisement folded inside her coat had promised only a farm in northern Minnesota, a widowed father, and a little boy who needed someone to care for him. It never said what kind of silence waited at the end of the journey. If you enjoy stories where ordinary people change lives in ways no one expects, stay with this one. Every mile ahead carries a choice that quietly changes 3 lives forever. She waited nearly an hour before climbing onto the northbound stagecoach. The road stretched through birch forests already turning pale. Frost covered the ditches beside the trail. Small creeks carried thin sheets of ice that cracked whenever the wheels passed nearby. She watched everything without speaking. New land always revealed itself through small details first. The fences, the smoke from distant chimneys, the hawk sitting perfectly still above an empty field. Late that afternoon, the driver stopped outside a dry goods store in the tiny farming town of Kinsley Falls. Across the street stood a tall man beside a wagon. He was studying one of his horses instead of watching the passengers. His rough hands ran carefully down the animal's front leg before checking the worn leather harness. Only after finishing did he notice the woman crossing toward him. She stopped a few feet away. "I answered your notice," she said softly. The man looked at her face, then at the single travel bag resting beside her boots. He gave one short nod. "My name is Daniel Larson." She answered with careful English. "Ingrid Solberg." Neither offered another sentence. Daniel lifted her bag into the wagon without asking. The ride home began almost entirely in silence. The harvested fields rolled past beneath a sky growing darker by the minute. Empty corn stalks rattled against one another whenever the wind crossed them. After nearly half an hour, Daniel finally spoke. "My son's name is Caleb." He kept his eyes on the road. "He's 6. Ingrid nodded. "He doesn't talk much." Those 4 words stayed with her. Not because of what they said, because of everything they did not say. The farm appeared beyond a line of birch trees serving as a windbreak. Nothing about it looked neglected. Everything looked useful. A weathered farmhouse. A large red barn. 2 sheds. Split firewood stacked with perfect care. No flowers. No porch swing. No sign that anyone had thought about beauty in a very long time. The wagon stopped beside the porch. Before Ingrid could lift her own bag, an older woman opened the front door. She carried herself like someone who had spent decades solving problems before breakfast. "You made it," she said. "I'm Martha. My cousin Daniel asked me to help after his wife passed." Her voice held kindness without softness. She handed Ingrid a clean dish towel almost immediately. "The kitchen's this way. No welcome speech. No awkward questions. Just work waiting to be done." Ingrid smiled to herself. Some women understood each other without needing introductions. After learning where everything belonged, Martha pointed toward the staircase, the boys upstairs. Ingrid climbed slowly. The hallway remained perfectly still. Only one room showed light beneath the door. She knocked once before stepping inside. A little boy sat cross-legged on the wooden floor. Small stones surrounded him in neat rows. Not toys. Not random piles. Patterns. He didn't look frightened. He simply watched her with pale gray eyes that never left her face. She remained standing. She didn't rush toward him. Children noticed forced kindness before adults ever did. Instead, she looked at the stones. "You sorted these." No answer. She studied them another moment. The darkest ones here. The lighter ones there. and these belong somewhere between. The boy slowly reached down. He picked up one smooth gray stone and held it toward her. She accepted it carefully. It was cool against her palm. River-worn. One thin white line crossed the middle. "This came from running water," she said quietly. The creek polished it. He looked at the stone, then back at her. She returned it without another word. That seemed enough. She left him sitting exactly where she had found him. Downstairs supper was nearly ready. Rabbit stew filled the kitchen with warm smells. Fresh bread cooled beside the stove. Daniel entered through the back door, carrying cold air with him. He washed his hands at the pump before sitting silently at the table. Caleb joined them a minute later. No one hurried the meal. No one filled the silence with useless conversation. Spoons touched bowls. Firewood cracked inside the stove. Outside, the evening wind pushed gently against the windows. Ingrid noticed something else. Caleb examined every bite before eating, not because he disliked the food, because careful habits had become part of him. Children learned strange routines after losing someone. Nobody explained them. They simply appeared. When supper ended, Martha wrapped her scarf around her shoulders. "I'll see you tomorrow." The front door closed behind her. Daniel carried the heavy pot toward the sink. Ingrid quietly washed the dishes. They worked side by side without speaking. It felt strangely natural. When everything was finished, Daniel pointed toward a small room beside the kitchen. "You can stay there. It isn't large." "It'll do," Ingrid answered. He nodded once and stepped outside toward the barn again. She remained alone in the kitchen. The house had its own kind of silence. Not empty, not peaceful. It sounded like people who had grown used to living around something they could no longer fix. Before going to bed, Ingrid climbed the stairs once more. Caleb's bedroom door stood partly open. He had fallen asleep beside the little wooden chest. The stones remained carefully arranged around him. She quietly covered him with the blanket that had slipped away. As she turned toward the hallway, something caught her eye. Tucked beneath the edge of his pillow was a folded piece of paper. Only one corner showed. She hadn't meant to notice it. She certainly hadn't meant to stop. But the childish drawing peeking from that folded page made her freeze in place. It showed 3 people standing together outside the farmhouse. The father, the little boy, and a woman whose face had been carefully sketched long before Ingrid ever arrived. The first snow arrived before sunrise. Ingrid knew it before she opened her eyes. The whole house sounded different. The wind no longer scraped across the walls. Every outside sound had softened beneath a thin white blanket covering the fields. She dressed quietly, lit the stove, and stepped onto the porch with a steaming cup between her hands. The farm had changed overnight. Fence posts wore white caps. The barn roof carried a clean layer of snow. Smoke drifted straight into the still morning air. Daniel walked from the barn carrying a bucket of grain. He noticed her standing there, but said nothing. He simply looked across the frozen fields for a long moment, measuring the day the way farmers always had. She understood. Some people greeted the morning with words. Others greeted it by watching the sky. Inside, Caleb sat at the kitchen table staring through the window. His oatmeal rested untouched. He wasn't looking at the snow itself. He was watching how it settled along the old fence line. "The school wagon won't come today," Ingrid said while setting another log into the stove. He nodded once. She poured warm milk into his bowl. Then she smiled gently. "Would you like to show me where your stones come from?" The spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. He looked toward the window again. A minute later, he climbed down from the chair, already pulling on his boots. That was answer enough. The trail behind the farmhouse disappeared beneath fresh snow. Caleb walked ahead without hesitation. He never looked back to see if she followed. He simply trusted that she would. The birch trees stood perfectly still. Every branch carried tiny crystals that caught the morning light. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a woodpecker tapped steadily against frozen bark. The sound carried much farther in winter. After nearly 20 minutes, Caleb stopped beside what looked like an ordinary snowbank. He knelt. With both mittens, he brushed away the snow. Water whispered beneath the ice. A narrow creek still flowed below the frozen surface. He reached into the muddy bank and pulled free another smooth stone. Without speaking, he handed it to Ingrid. She turned it slowly. This one traveled a long way. He watched her closely. Water only makes a stone this smooth after many years. He accepted it back with surprising care. Then, he slipped it into his coat pocket beside several others. Only then did Ingrid understand. The stones were never just stones. They were memories. Small pieces of a world that never disappeared. She never asked why. Some questions deserved more time than one walk through the woods. On the way home, they spotted deer tracks crossing the snow. Caleb stopped beside them. He crouched low and pointed. Ingrid smiled. 2 of them. He nodded. A mother, he whispered. It was the longest sentence she had heard since arriving. She looked toward him. He was already following the tracks with his eyes. She said nothing. Some moments became smaller the instant adults celebrated them. This one belonged to him. That evening, Daniel returned late from repairing a broken fence. Snow covered his shoulders. Before he reached the kitchen, Ingrid had already placed hot coffee beside the stove. He removed his gloves, wrapped both hands around the cup. Then looked toward her. You didn't have to. I know. He took one slow drink. Neither spoke again. But something inside the room felt warmer than the fire alone. If you've stayed with this story until now, you've probably noticed something important. Sometimes survival isn't only about staying alive through winter. Sometimes it's about finding one person who quietly gives a house permission to breathe again. The days settled into a steady rhythm. Bread baked every Monday and Thursday. Laundry dried beside the stove. Caleb walked to school whenever the roads allowed. Daniel worked from first light until darkness covered the fields. Without trying, Ingrid began changing small things. She repaired the loose kitchen window where cold air slipped inside. She organized the pantry so every jar could be reached without searching. She mended worn blankets before they became useless. She never announced what she had done. The family simply noticed one problem after another disappearing. One Saturday morning, Caleb followed her from room to room while she sealed another draft near his bedroom window. He stood quietly with his hands inside his pockets, watching every movement. When she finished, she brushed the sawdust from her apron. The wind won't bother you here anymore. He touched the repaired frame, pressed gently against the wool packing, then looked toward her. A tiny smile appeared, barely there, gone almost immediately. Still, she saw it. That afternoon, she climbed onto a chair while dusting the highest kitchen shelf. Something hidden behind several jars caught her attention. A faded green bottle. Inside rested 3 dried wildflowers. She carefully lifted it into the light. The flowers had become brittle with age. No one had touched them for years. She heard footsteps behind her. Daniel had entered without making a sound. He looked at the bottle. His shoulders became perfectly still. My wife picked those, he said quietly. First summer after we built the house. Ingrid held the bottle with both hands. They're still beautiful. Daniel looked out the window instead of answering. I couldn't throw them away. You don't have to. He nodded once. She placed the bottle back exactly where it had been. Not everything broken needed fixing. Some things simply needed someone willing to leave them where love had left them. A week before Christmas, Ingrid baked sweet rice pudding the way her mother had taught her in Norway. She hid one almond inside. Caleb searched every spoonful carefully. Finally, he held the tiny almond high above the table. Ingrid laughed softly. In my family, whoever finds it receives a prize. She handed him a single piece of peppermint candy wrapped in red paper. He studied it for several seconds. Instead of eating it, he carefully slipped it into his pocket. Daniel watched his son, then looked across the table toward Ingrid. For the first time since she had arrived, he smiled, without trying to hide it. Later that night, long after Caleb had gone upstairs, Daniel unfolded an old letter resting inside his coat. He stared at it for several minutes before speaking. My younger brother wrote again. Ingrid continued folding towels. He wants to sell his farm in Iowa. She listened quietly. He says he'll come here in the spring. Daniel stopped speaking. His fingers tightened around the letter. Finally, he looked toward her. There may not be room for everyone. Ingrid lowered the towel slowly. She already understood what he hadn't yet found the courage to ask. Outside, the winter wind pushed hard against the windows. Inside, neither of them moved. The words stayed between them long after the fire settled into glowing coals. Daniel folded the letter carefully and slipped it back inside his coat. I wasn't asking you to leave, he said. Ingrid met his eyes. I know. Neither of them spoke again. Outside, snow brushed against the windows. Inside, Caleb slept upstairs, unaware that one quiet conversation had changed the air inside the house. The next morning began colder than any before. The pump handle fought against the ice. The horses breathed thick clouds into the dawn. The barn roof groaned under fresh snow. Daniel headed toward the pasture before sunrise, while Ingrid packed Caleb's lunch and buttoned his heavy coat. She noticed something different. He no longer waited to be reminded. He reached for his scarf, pulled on his mittens, then stood by the door looking back at her. Ready, he said. One word. Simple, yet it filled the kitchen more completely than long conversations ever could. She smiled. So am I. The walk to the school road had become their morning habit. Some days they spoke. Most days they simply listened. Crows calling across frozen fields, the squeak of boots on packed snow, branches tapping together high above the trail. Caleb suddenly stopped beside the old birch grove. He pointed toward a broken fence. A small rabbit sat perfectly still beneath it. Its white coat almost disappeared against the snow. They both remained frozen. After several long seconds, the rabbit darted into the trees. Caleb watched until it vanished. Then, almost to himself, he whispered, "It knows where home is." Ingrid looked toward him. He had not spoken about himself, yet somehow, he had. Christmas passed quietly. No visitors, no large celebration, only warm bread, candlelight, and the little traditions Ingrid carried across the ocean with her. The dried flowers remained on the high shelf. The almond game returned. This time Caleb laughed before anyone else did. The sound surprised even him. Daniel looked across the table. His spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. For just a second, the room felt as though someone who had been missing for years had quietly walked back through the front door. A few days later, Martha arrived carrying fresh butter and news from town. She removed her gloves beside the stove. People have started talking. Daniel looked up. About what? She glanced toward Ingrid. They're wondering how long she'll stay. Silence settled over the kitchen. Martha continued. Some folks think she'll leave when spring comes. Others think your brother's coming to take over. Daniel rubbed one hand across his beard. They've got too much time. They always do. Martha gave a short smile. That doesn't stop them. After she left, nobody mentioned the conversation again. But Ingrid noticed Daniel standing longer than usual outside the barn that evening. He wasn't looking at the cattle. He wasn't studying the fences. He was staring toward the road leading into town, as though wondering how strangers could know so much and understand so little. Weeks passed. January buried the farm beneath deeper snow. Wind pushed hard enough to rattle every window. Some mornings the thermometer refused to climb above 0. Still, life moved forward. Bread, wood, laundry, lessons, coffee warming beside the stove. Every ordinary task quietly stitched another thread into the life they now shared. One afternoon, Caleb came home carrying something wrapped inside his scarf. He laid it carefully on the kitchen table. Ingrid unfolded the cloth. Inside rested a smooth stone unlike any she had seen before. Deep red. Thin white bands circled its middle. He watched her face closely. "You found this?" He nodded. She held it toward the window. "It's beautiful." Then she paused. "I think this one's special." He smiled. Instead of placing it with the others upstairs, he pushed it gently across the table toward her. She looked at him. "For you." Her fingers stopped. She understood immediately what the gift meant. Children did not hand away the things they treasured without reason. She accepted it with both hands. "Thank you." That evening she placed the stone on the kitchen windowsill, where the afternoon light touched it every day. She never moved it again. If this story has stayed with you, remember this as we move forward. Sometimes the strongest bond begins with something as small as a shared walk, a warm meal, or a child quietly placing his greatest treasure into someone else's hands. Late in February, another letter arrived. Daniel opened it after supper. He read every line. Then, read it again. Caleb continued drawing quietly. Ingrid kept sewing without interrupting. Finally, Daniel folded the paper. "My brother's coming sooner." She waited. "He'll be here before planting season." The room grew still. "He says he'll bring his wife and their 2 boys." Ingrid slowly lowered her needle. There were only 3 bedrooms in the farmhouse. One already held Caleb. One belonged to Daniel. The small room beside the kitchen belonged to her. She didn't need anyone to explain the problem. That night she lay awake listening to the wind. Not because of the cold, because she had finally found a place where tomorrow felt worth waiting for. Before dawn, she quietly packed part of her suitcase. Not everything, only enough that leaving would hurt a little less if it became necessary. She slid the bag beneath the bed before anyone woke. The next morning, she prepared breakfast exactly as always. Nothing in her face revealed the decision growing quietly inside her. But someone noticed. Caleb. He watched her longer than usual. His spoon never touched the oatmeal. When Daniel stepped outside toward the barn, Caleb climbed down from his chair. Without saying a word, he disappeared upstairs. A minute later, he returned carrying the folded drawing Ingrid had once seen beneath his pillow. This time, he placed it gently into her hands. She opened it. The picture had changed. There were still 3 people standing in front of the farmhouse. But now, carefully colored beside them, someone had drawn a 4th figure, and above that new figure, written in careful, uneven letters, was one simple word. Mama. Caleb did not look away. His small hand rested on the drawing while Ingrid held it. The uneven letters leaned across the page. Mama. Not written because someone had told him to. Not copied from a lesson. Written because somewhere inside that quiet little boy, the word had finally found its place. Ingrid looked up. Caleb stood perfectly still. He wasn't waiting for praise. He wasn't asking a question. He simply wanted her to know. She folded the paper with slow, careful hands and placed it against her heart for a moment. Then she knelt beside him. "You should keep this." He shook his head. One small movement. Certain. It belongs here. She accepted the drawing. Nothing more needed saying. That afternoon, Daniel returned from the barn carrying a sack of feed over one shoulder. He noticed the paper resting beside Ingrid's sewing basket. He recognized Caleb's drawings immediately. "What is it?" he asked. She handed it to him without speaking. He unfolded the page. His eyes moved slowly across the picture. The farmhouse. The 4 figures. The single word above Ingrid. He remained standing beside the table. The room stayed completely quiet. Finally, he lowered the paper. "When did he draw this?" "This morning." Daniel looked toward the staircase where Caleb had already disappeared upstairs. His fingers tightened around the edge of the paper. For several seconds, he could not find any words. Then, he quietly folded the drawing again and returned it to Ingrid. "He hasn't called anyone that." His voice stopped. "He hasn't since his mother. That evening's supper tasted no different. The bread was the same. The stew simmered exactly as always. Yet every chair around the table somehow carried a different weight." Caleb spoke twice during the meal, once to ask for more potatoes, once to tell Daniel that the school roof needed fixing before spring rains. Neither sentence was remarkable. Yet Daniel listened to every word as though hearing his son's voice for the first time in years. Winter slowly loosened its grip. The snow along the fence rows began shrinking. Water dripped steadily from the barn roof each afternoon. The fields remained brown and sleeping beneath the melting patches of ice. One morning a wagon rolled into the yard. A younger man climbed down. Behind him came a woman holding a little girl's hand, while 2 boys jumped from the back of the wagon laughing. Daniel's brother had arrived. The farmhouse suddenly felt smaller. Children's boots crowded the porch. Coats filled every hook beside the door. Voices echoed through rooms that had spent years almost silent. That first evening, everyone squeezed around the kitchen table. The brother studied the house while eating. Finally, he looked toward Ingrid. "So you're the lady from Norway?" She smiled politely. "I am." He nodded. "My brother's letters never mentioned how much you've done around here." Daniel quietly looked down at his plate. The brother continued. "I figured I'd be helping a man barely keeping up." Instead, he glanced around the warm kitchen, the repaired windows, fresh bread cooling on the counter, children laughing together in the next room. "This doesn't look like a house that's falling apart." Daniel finally spoke. "It isn't." The answer was short. But it carried more meaning than anyone at the table missed. The days that followed proved something else. Daniel's brother had not come to replace anyone. He had come because another pair of hands was needed. The farm had grown. The cattle had increased. More fields needed planting than one man could manage alone. There had never been a choice between family and Ingrid. Only a place waiting for everyone. One afternoon, Daniel found Ingrid hanging laundry behind the house. The spring wind pulled gently at the clean sheets. He stood beside the clothesline for a moment before speaking. "I owe you an apology." She looked at him. "I should have said it sooner." She waited quietly. "When I placed that notice in the newspaper," he looked across the fields, where Caleb and the other boys were chasing each other between the fence posts. "I thought I was hiring someone to cook meals." He smiled softly. "I didn't understand what my son had actually lost." Ingrid watched Caleb's laughter drift across the pasture. He didn't need another mother. Daniel looked toward his son. No, he needed someone willing to stay beside him until he could smile again. Daniel nodded slowly. "And somehow, you did." Several weeks later, the town gathered for the spring social at the church hall. Families filled long wooden tables with pies, roasted chicken, fresh bread, and preserves saved through winter. Neighbors greeted one another after months of snow. Children ran through the yard, chasing each other beneath the warming sun. Martha stood near the entrance speaking with several women when she noticed Caleb pulling Ingrid toward the dessert table. Someone nearby smiled. "Your daughter makes wonderful pies." Before Ingrid could gently correct them, Caleb answered first. "She's not my daughter." The woman looked embarrassed. "Oh." Caleb reached for Ingrid's hand. He held it tightly. "She's my mama." The room became very still. No one laughed. No one corrected him. Across the hall, Daniel stood watching. His eyes met Ingrid's. He gave the same quiet nod he had given on the day she climbed into his wagon outside the dry goods store. Only now, it carried an entirely different meaning. Months later, another letter crossed the Atlantic. This one traveled all the way to a small village outside Trondheim. An elderly aunt unfolded the pages beside her window. Inside were simple words. No grand stories, no long speeches. Only news of a little Minnesota farm. Of spring calves, fresh bread, a boy who collected smooth stones from a creek, a widowed farmer learning to smile again. And one final sentence. "I crossed an ocean believing I was coming to care for a child. Instead, the child quietly gave me back a family." Outside the farmhouse, summer wind moved gently through the birch trees. On the kitchen windowsill, the red stone Caleb had once given her still caught the afternoon light. Beside it rested a folded drawing that no one ever put away. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes that the quietest acts of kindness often leave the deepest mark.